Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to another season of Karen's Quilt Circles. And we are going to kick it off with another inspiring guest. I bet the first word out of your mouth after you see her amazing designs is wow. Veruschka Zarate of Pride and Joy Quilting has combined color and foundation paper piecing in a bold new way. Her patterns are clean and clear, but before we ever see them, it takes a lot of behind the scenes time and effort, and she's going to tell us all about it. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Veruschka Zarate. Thank you, Veruschka, for being on the show. You're coming from the West Coast. Whereabouts on the West Coast are you?
I am. I like to say I'm from Los Angeles. However, it's only because it's easier for people to identify. But I am in a little town called Redlands. That's right smack in the middle between LA and Palm Springs. So I'm about an hour away from the beach, an hour away from the desert, but Southern California.
So when did you make your first quilt?
As I've begun to get to know quilters and speak to quilters, it's been so amazing to hear how oftentimes quilters learn through this sort of intergenerational experience, right? Like I learned from my mom or my grandmother. For me, I learned quilting out of necessity. So after I had had my children, I began to bulk up mounds and mounds of baby clothes. My husband one day comes to me and says, Veruschka, our closet is full of clothes that doesn't fit our children versus the clothes that do fit them. There's no room for them. What are you going to do with all these clothes? And, Karen, I thought if I give these clothes away to someone else, they're just hand-me-downs. But to me, this fabric is seeped in memory, is seeped in meaning. So I went online, right? Like most people do nowadays, and Googled, what to do with baby clothes. Well, Karen, that was the beginning of my Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole experience of happening on memory quilts, learning about quilts. And the more I learned, the more I fell in love with the whole process of quilting. And my mentality was, Karen, I have to know what I'm doing before I cut into these precious clothes, right? Because it's not like, oh, I messed up, so I have to go and, I can go and buy another yard of fabric of that baby clothes. No, you got to have one shot with this. And so after months and months of learning, I would say that I finished my first quilt block in the middle of 2016. And from there, I was just, I was in love with the whole entire, I couldn't get my hands on enough stuff to learn.
So you say that your mother and aunt, grandmother, etc., didn't quilt, but were they makers of any kind?
That's a great question. No one has asked me that. My maternal grandmother was an artist. She was born in Cuba, the daughter of the village alcalde and an Irish immigrant who had come to the country. And she was an artist. I mean, she would bake and sew. And that was back in the time when, there wasn't YouTube videos to watch, right? I mean, she just had this natural inclination to create. My mother, she's so cute. She says, your grandmother used to force me to learn, so I can technically learn to do this stuff, but it's not my thing. So I think she makes the joke that she thinks that it skipped a generation, but my mother's a wonderful gardener. So it's so funny because her and I have this ongoing joke where I enjoy sewing now and she enjoys gardening, and we both aren't good at the talents of the other. My paternal grandmother was the mother of 6 children, and so a lot of her talents, if you will, were around a time where she needed to make everything for her kids. So she told once I got into sewing and before she passed, I gifted her a quilt I made. And she said, I never thought one of my granddaughters would quilt, because for her, sewing was a chore, mending things constantly. Now that I reflect on it, Karen, I always remember my paternal grandmother, her name was Alicia, always having a little tin, like a little tin of something, creams or something, that was full of tangled up thread and needles. She always had that on hand. So like if a button fell off, she jumped on it. So yeah, I think it's definitely a part of most people's lives in some way. I had someone comment to me once, where there's a human being, there will be some sort of textile, right? Whether that's us wrapping ourselves in it or covering ourselves. So I think it's definitely a part of our human existence.
If you read Cassia Sinclair's book, The Golden Threads, that is a great read about textiles.
Oh.
And it talks about how these big leap forwards that humans have made, textiles are at the base of it all.
My whole quilting world kind of exploded within this last year. And as I've gotten to know more and more quilters, really virtually, because the world was shut down, right? It's amazing to me to hear how much of a tradition quilting really comes from, places like England, Scotland, colder regions, right? I mean, where my family comes from, warm climate Caribbean places, we don't have a tradition of, soft billowy blankets because it's warm, right? But our tradition of textiles is woven fabrics like that'll shield you from, a brisk wind. So it's been interesting seeing how textile definitely is a part of our cultural almost world placement, where we come from and how that textile reflects our culture and our needs, right?
You had memories to memorialize, but what was it about quilting that pulled you in?
All of it, Karen. As I reflect back in what started my quilting experience, I think there was something where all of these things came together and provided a very therapeutic, cathartic feeling. So before I had my children, we actually thought we couldn't have kids for 10 years. I professionally, went to grad school to get a degree in counseling psychology and therapy, but I would take community college courses in Illustrator, in Adobe Photoshop, in color design, in construction. So I was always dabbling in art. But once I had my children, which were my two little miracles, where pride and joy quilting comes from, right? I decided to stay home. And there was something really therapeutic where at the end of the day of, you know, pouring myself out into my children, nurturing them, feeding them, keeping them alive, right? And I know this sounds strange, but there was something so therapeutic about knowing that if I put these two pieces of fabric together under a sewing machine, that at the end of the day, I had something tangible to show, right? I think in the whole process of learning more, I just took like duck to water. The whole journey of learning and stumbling and seam ripping and trying again was actually really enjoyable. And I think that that to me was like the click, where you do something and you lose track of time while you're doing it. That's something that resonates in your spirit. And that can be anything, right? For my mom, that's gardening. She could be gardening for hours on end. And I'm like, Mom, it's nighttime, right? Dinner time. And there was something about learning about quilting in particular. I mean, I can't sew anything else. I mean, I'll hem my husband's pants once in a while, and I'll sew little things here and there, but I'm useless in those things. But there was something just really soul enriching about creating something with fabric at the end of the day, when the day was quiet, when the house was quiet and dark, that I could really kind of pour back into myself.
So I was looking through your Instagram and you started off with beautiful traditional blocks
Huh?
and printed fabrics. And then suddenly there's this big shift in one picture. There's this shift and you're this amazing paper piecer. What happened?
The way I happened on foundation paper piecing was exactly the same way I happened on quilting, by a mix of accident and need. So my sweet husband gifted me for my first Mother's Day with both of my boys a sewing machine he had gotten off of QVC. And at the time I had a newborn and a 1-year old, so I didn't even open the sewing machine until a year later. And then it didn't work out of the box, so we had to go get it fixed. So after I fell in love with quilting, I said to him, you know what? I think it's time to upgrade this sewing machine. And so that led into, I need better scissors, right? I mean, we need good tools. I need a bigger sewing table. We started this joke about, okay, Veruschka, what new unicorn is going to change all your sewing experience do you need in your sewing room? So I thought it'll be cute and funny to make him a unicorn block. And even before I made the unicorn block, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I started doing more detailed traditional piecing, like Elizabeth Hartman stuff, which I think is just so amazing. So I was already sort of inclining toward more even detailed piecing. And so I go to online, right? Try to research some patterns, and I see this pattern. And I thought, wow, this is a quilt pattern. I wonder how this is pieced, right? I wonder, like, how am I going to cut these pieces out? I had no idea it was foundation paper piecing. I bought it by Robbie Patterns. It's a unicorn. I probably learned the way most people should not learn, which is jumping in the deep end without any instruction. I was so disoriented in which way the paper went. I didn't understand. At the time, Karen, I couldn't find that many resources on technique building of foundation paper piecing. Like, there was some splattered here and there, but they weren't clicking for me. So I learned just out of sheer determination. I was like, I can do this. I have to finish this block. And after completing that block, number one, I felt very proud of myself because I didn't give up and I kept going. And then halfway through, like, something clicked. Like, oh, this isn't as hard as I'm making it out to be. Oh, if I shift this, then there's a rhythm to it. Oh, I don't get disoriented if I place things. So there was something in just being thrown in the deep end that got me finally swimming and creating a rhythm. So one of the things that I liked about foundation paper piecing was that it took the guesswork out of where to sew. I mean, you sew through the paper with the fabric underneath along the line. So I loved that about it, but I love the precision that it gave. And once I did the unicorn quilt, I just started trying to find patterns that called out to me to just do more and more foundation paper pieces. And along the way, I realized that that's what I loved doing. And so I thought, what would it look like if I designed my own pattern, right? And I'll say the first couple drafts, they were just pencil and paper. I printed off something that I had mocked up on Photoshop, and I just printed it out and took a yardstick ruler and created lines to see what that would look like. When I started drafting sort of like the normal things, right? A heart, a flower, animals. But I thought, what would it look like for me to do something that touches my spirit? And and Audrey Hepburn actually came to mind because growing up, my mother learned English from watching Audrey Hepburn movies. And even growing up as a child, we would have Audrey Hepburn playing in the backdrop. I mean, on repeat almost. It's really cute because my mother learned English listening to Audrey Hepburn movies, and my dad learned English listening to the Beatles. What I liked about solids and what I identified with solids early on, even with some of the traditional pieces, was that solids really can give this really modern, clean look. And I love that. I like a simple, clean, minimalist look that looks that's minimal but looks complicated. And I really fell in love with Vanessa Christensen's line of ombre fabrics, which in one yard, you have one hue that goes from dark to light. So it takes the guesswork out of, are these pinks on the same, variance, or this is too yellowy, or this is too green, or this is too peachy. So I found that even with my traditional quilts, I was beginning to do V&Co ombres. When I started doing more detailed foundation paper piecing, I found that solids could create this unified shaping. So what that means is when you're working with a complicated subject that has curves in it, and I'm using straight lines to achieve that shape, how do I create continuity of shape, right? Because unlike applique, where you can, cut out, an entire shape as complex as it is, which is the beauty of applique. The challenge with foundation paper piecing is basically you're sewing geometric shapes to create this larger subject. And so what I found, Karen, with solids is that I could give the illusion of continuity between multiple shapes by just using the same fabric. For example, in my self-portrait, my hands, for example, there's several sections of the hand, right? There's the wrist, there's the back of the hand, there's the fingers. But because I use the same color, it gives the illusion that it's one shape. When you look up close, you see there's lots of seams in it. So that's what pulled me towards solids, was that I loved the simplistic modern effect. I loved that I could create continuity of shape within a complex subject. The challenge actually with solids is that it increases the margin of error. So like if you mess up using a solid, I think it's easier to identify the mistake when you're using a solid color, because then it's striking, right? You don't have the pattern to sort of distract from the eye a bit.
So have you changed the way that you look at color now that you've got your own design aesthetic?
I do. So when I did Audrey, I learned a lot from that piece because it was the first major piece that I went from how does something look on your computer when you design it or on paper versus how does it sew? And those are two very different worlds. And one of the things that I learned about color with Audrey Hepburn was I attempted to do this sort of realistic effect, right? So how did I, picking fabrics that matched her skin tone, the variance of the highlights and the lowlights of the face, the cheekbone. It was very difficult to do that. And I felt like my eye, Karen, was saying, I see what you're trying to do here, Veruschka, but it's not really working. She looks a little choppy. So when I went on to do my next major piece, which takes me months to design and draft, and actually probably redraft a design, I don't know, 5 or 6 times, because I'm constantly attempting to make it easier to construct and execute. The next one was Martin Luther King Jr. And with that one, I took a very different route than with Audrey Hepburn. With that one, I thought, well, what if I, inspired by works like Biza Butler and other applique artists who do color as representation of skin tones. And I mean, you have classic artists like Picasso and Salvador Dali who would use colors that you wouldn't think as portraits, right? Why would you use purples as part of the face, or bright yellows? But it works when you have a color palette that is designed for the different hues of the face. So for my MLK portrait, what I decided was, okay, all of the dark features, the shadows of the face will be navies, blues, a touch of purple, but let's keep it in the dark blues. And then the light portion where the light would hit his face, the highlights of the face, I went for yellows and whites and pinks with a touch of like violet. And I loved it. I felt like my eye was like, yeah, we know that, his cheek isn't bright pink, but like I felt visually is much more appealing to use color as representation of the skin tones instead of trying to match it exactly. For me, something just felt like it clicked. But something that I learned with my MLK, I don't know if I'll do it again, but with him, I used something like 270 different colors of solids. And that's a lot. So it was a challenge to manage. It was a challenge to get. I had a coupon from months earlier where you could buy the whole entire Kona collection in one. You would get one 5-inch square of a color, and they would sell it in these little charm packs. And so I ended up using that for the project. And when I needed more fabric of a certain solid, like for example, his suit, right? His suit would go from the shoulder to the bust. I would just order that particular solid color a little more. And so I learned, okay, that is not sustainable. I do not have, all yardage of every single solid color in existence. So that's where I learned what would it look like to develop a palette? What are the colors that call to me? What are the colors that I enjoy working from? And so Now when I look at a piece, I mean, I'll vary a little. I don't use too much green, but some pieces I will use green, like my lion. If it calls for that extra, hue, I'll add it to that. But I try to maintain within that a specific color palette because it makes designing easy. I mean, you kind of take the guesswork out of what color will go where.
Have you experimented with other fabrics?
I've attempted to use woven fabrics for background. So one of my favorite woven backgrounds is cross weave by Motive Fabrics. And so what I find, Karen, that I'm doing now is that if I use a patterned fabric, I'll use it as like a highlight. So everything will be solid except one thing. But I love when I see quilters that send me a pattern that they've made of mine and they've used patterned fabric. And it blows my mind because I think in very solid colors right now.
So, when did you realize that you were doing something unique in the quilting world?
When we start doing something because it brings us joy, we take the risk, right, of sharing it to the world. We take the risk that people will either, best case scenario, ignore it, right? Hopefully, you don't get some hate. When I started posting my MLK portrait, all of a sudden I started getting messages from people saying, I'd love to do this. How did you do this? What colors did you use? How do you make a pattern? And I thought, wow, how do you take like I didn't even know where to begin from going from a hobby to like a commercialization, right? So that's when I thought, what would it look like if I then, you know, started developing patterns that others could execute? Because those are two very different worlds, right? Like if I draft a pattern for myself, that's very different than how I go about writing, instructing, helping someone else understand how I have put this puzzle together. But that was the first time, and that took me down a path of what would it look like. And I'm still learning a lot. I mean, there's been some wonderful highs, some vertigo causing lows, and it's complicated when you're dealing with people's faces. That's what I've learned. Newbies like me and even experts. It's not just is the photo public domain. No, there are complexities to dealing with people, famous people's faces that I've learned along the way. And so you'll see that much of my stuff is, more simple designs, but I've begun to develop these two collections, one of classic heroines that lived 100 years ago, and that's for a specific reason. And another is a collection of 4 pieces of classic masterpieces. So I've begun drafting those and thinking about how do I go about sort of birthing those into the world, if you will.
Let's talk about that fantastic portrait that you've done of you and your boys. How do you design a quilt that large and that detailed?
That was the first quilt that I've done that large. So it was 70 by 70. I only used about 17 solids. So again, I increased the margin of error. And now I look at it and I'm like, oh, I should have used it different. But probably only I can see that. So at first I attempted to do that pattern, drafting it all as one, right? So I mean, it's something like, I don't remember the number exactly, almost 3,000 single shapes, but within larger foundation paper pieces, right? At first, I attempted making it one pattern, and that was too overwhelming. I was getting lost in even printing it out on Adobe Illustrator, kept crashing on me. I mean, it didn't work to create one pattern. So what I ended up doing for that particular piece was I ended up creating 8 individual patterns. And it's sort of like, have you ever seen the movie Inception where there's a dream inside of a
Yes.
dream? Okay, so this was like my Inception. This was like every single individual paper, foundation paper piece is a puzzle, which formed a piece of a larger puzzle, which formed a piece of a larger. So there was like a little quilt inside another quilt. So it ended up being 8 individual patterns that I, I sized and brought together multiple times before I sewed it up. So I would print it out, cut out all the pieces, and sort of lay them out first. Because that's one of the challenges with foundation paper piecing, is that you're using paper as the guide, right? So a lot of time and sort of stepping back and reflecting has to happen before you even start sewing, which is why I talk about, oftentimes I'll do an initial draft. And when I say draft is, how do I cut up this subject in a way that I can sew it up? And that's the hardest part. And so I did that, oh, tens of times, right? It didn't work as one. How would it look like if I divided it up? Once I did that, I would print it out, kind of lay it out all on the floor. Ooh, those pieces don't really go together. And so the challenge was really honing it down so that, number one, it would make sense constructively, and number two, that I could actually sew this up together. Because if I had to sew every single shape onto itself, that would be impossible. I think there are some quilters that do that out there. They're geniuses. I need a large foundation paper piece, or else I get lost. But there's so much geometry that happens in foundation paper piecing. Like this piece needs to fit perfectly in this piece, or else it throws off the whole piece. So that was the biggest challenge, was how do I construct this in a way that will make sense and that I could actually execute it successfully.
With your designs being so intricate, what sewing skills have you had to improve to successfully implement your ideas?
That's a great question. And I know they sound so simple, but they make such a big difference. So the first is prepping my fabric. So in the beginning, I would maybe starch a little bit. I don't really pre-wash, but once I started starching my fabric so I will take a yard of fabric and I'll starch it till it's, soaking wet. I'll let it air dry, and then I hang it. So I have this, when I'm ready to work on a project, I'll have a pole, and I basically drape all of my pieces on that pole so that I'm not looking through them. Like, that's something that I learned, because in the beginning I had a laundry basket, Karen, and I would throw all of my fabric in there, and I wasted time looking. So I'm constantly trying to create efficiency, right? I don't want to waste time on something that is a waste of time. So one of the things that I found was prepping my fabric so that it's already pre-shrunk because of the starch. But then when I go to manipulate it in the sewing, it's not going to shift on me, right? Because it's already prepped. That was the first thing that I learned through trial and error. The second was, even in foundation paper piecing, it's essential to know in which direction the fabric is going. So every single shape, I mean, it's not always possible, but I really try, Karen, to make sure that the primary anchoring seam is done along the grain and not along the bias. Because I learned through trial and error that if you sew a shape, just because you have a piece of fabric that'll fit that particular shape, but it's on the bias, it will create a wonky stretch, or has the potential to create a wonky stretch that can throw off the overall piece, right? So I learned, hey, if I anchor a shape along the grain, then it's nice and stiff and sturdy and will lay flat and won't alter the shape on the foundation paper piece. And one person asked me, they're like, well, if you sew along the grain in the initial sew line, won't everything else be on the bias? It will, but it's anchored, right? So it won't shift on you. And because all of those additional shapes are also on the grain, it creates a sort of skeletal, firmness to it.
Yeah.
So I found that really helped a whole bunch. And another thing was, what type of thread to use. So a big part of it is, how do you minimize bulk? So I was constantly experimenting, how do I minimize bulk? Because like you said, so many of my pieces are detailed, which means more layering of fabric, right? So I experimented with different types of thread, and I found that Wonderfil's Deco Bob, which is a very thin 80 weight, 100 weight, but it's poly, so it's thin but it's strong. That helped a whole lot.
Is that in both the bobbin and the top?
Yeah, yeah. So because I'm aiming to continually reduce bulk, right? So my piece will lay nice and flat because that also lends to the overall execution of a piece, right? I mean, if you look at something, it might look great on paper, but how does it sew, right? And and if I'm able to achieve an overall level of crisp flatness, then the entire aesthetic of the piece is appealing, right? So I found that even something as minute as thread creates that. Reducing the stitch length, that was another thing. So initially I would read out there that stitch length can be around 1.8, maybe 1.5, but I found that an even shorter stitch length, like 1.35, sometimes even 1.3 if I'm feeling really, really courageous and I don't have to seam rip. The reason why that's really effective is number one, you can tear out the paper super easy at the end. But number two, like many of my pieces, I'll just show you. I don't know if people can see this, but I don't like when you fold over the seam. Sometimes you can see the thread in between, right? And when you're doing a lot of layering, there's that potential risk of seeing thread in between. And I didn't like that because I felt like, again, the overall success of a piece is all of these small bits that we do well along the way that lead to this collective successful experience. And it's the same with like ironing every piece. Like I make sure I iron with my tailor's clapper every single shape. So one of the things that I tell new FPPers is don't minimize the value of developing a habit of incorporating these successful small details, because it might seem like a detail to put the tailor's clapper on the end. Oh, I don't have to do that. But what I end up finding is that these collective small things end up leading to this very large impact at the end.
Do you quilt full time now?
My instinct is to say no because what I do full time is mother full time. That's I feel like that's my full time. However, I would definitely say that after this year, quilting has become a big focus in my life, and it's so exciting, Karen. From beginning to do something that you enjoy and learning and hitting some massive slow bumps along the way, but then getting these wonderful things that happen. It's definitely developing into something that I would have never thought. And I'm learning to enjoy the ride. One of the big steps was, how do I take this from a hobby to like a little business? And I didn't know how to do that. And there were some hiccups along the way, but that was a big learning curve. So putting patterns out there, what would that look like? And now I'm beginning to prep for kits. So it's like it's definitely growing and at a speed that at times I feel gives me a little bit of vertigo, but I'm just so excited. My little boys, and this is something that's very important to me about the whole full-time thing or not. My husband is now very excited to see his wife enjoying something and flourishing in something. But for me, what's very important as I take pride in joy quilting to like the next level is that my children be a part of it. So you'll see many of my videos on Instagram, they're in the background. And I don't know, maybe that's unprofessional, but that's my life, right? They're a part of my life. And many times, like we have this whole room that's a playroom, but they'll come and they'll sit where I'm sewing. And so, yes, it's becoming full time, but I want it to very much go hand in hand with my mothering of my children as they're little, because it will only be for a blink of an eye. Now, are there times where I just want unadulterated, unbothered hours? Yes, which is why most of my work happens at night.
Do your kids sew?
They want to. We've had a couple sewing sessions, but mommy's patience at times runs a little low. We only have one extra sewing machine, which is the original sewing machine my husband gave me, which is their sort of like their toy. play sewing machine. So I only have one and I have two boys. So the struggle always becomes this competition, who goes first and who stays there longest. So either I get another sewing machine for the other child, or I wait till they're a little older and their patience and emotional intelligence to actually wait is there.
Well, do they know that there's a junior quilter award at QuiltCon?
No, they don't. That would probably require mommy's help, and I'm like tapped out.
Tell me about the quilt behind you.
This is my latest pattern. It's called the Heart of a Lion. And it was actually born out of a conversation I was having with a friend about, how 2020 has been so challenging for the world entire, and at a macro level and at a micro level, how everyone's life has really altered in so many ways. And so we were talking about what defines resiliency in your life. Like how what have we learned about facing adversity during this chapter than before? And what does it mean to continue to get up and fight when you feel let down, discouraged, betrayed, disappointed, or in the face of injustice? Like, how do you develop that heart of a lion and say, okay, something knocked me down, but how do I keep going? And so out of that conversation, I was like, what if I do a lion pattern? But the thing is, there are FPP lion patterns out there, right? There's this great one by Violet Craft. There's another one by Legit Kits. I mean, there are lion patterns out there. But I thought, I'm gonna do my own spin on it, do something a little different. And it's just, a mini quilt. And I put it out there, and I was so pleasantly surprised to see the reception of it. So this particular pattern, actually, Karen, I kind of went overboard. I did 4 different sizes, which is a lot of computer work to reformat.
Yeah.
But
I've done that a couple of times saying, yeah, I'll do that 3 different ways, 3 different sizes. And then you're going, why?
why did I
Why?
do
One would have been good.
or like max 2, right? I think I went a little overboard. I don't think I'll do that again. But yeah, I was born from that place of finding resiliency.
So how many patterns are you working on at one time? Do you work serially one at a time, or do you work on many?
I wouldn't say more than 2. I mean, typically, so like I have 2 collections that I'm working on, and because I draft and redraft, like I'll do an initial draft and then I'll leave it be. And then I'll work on smaller projects that I can put up on my shop that I find most of the population enjoy smaller, achievable projects. But I'm working on these larger pieces that take larger time to do. So I would say no more than 2. I try to be really good about, if I start sewing up a sample, for example, finishing that before I start something else, because then I'll get lost. Like all the pieces will get lost. I'm like, where did this belong? So I aim for 1, sometimes 2.
Do you put a label on your quilt?
I do. So the fast way is I got these little hand woven labels. So I do that. But when I finish a quilt, I'm infamous, I would say, for finishing a top and I'm like, I did it, I'm done. And just leaving it and not actually finishing it, quilting it, binding it. But when I finally do finish a quilt, I try to hit all the bases. And I said, hey, I've gotten this far. Let's just do a label at the end.
Do you have a lecture or a workshop that people can find you in?
I am developing that, actually. Well, I'm super excited to have been invited to teach at QuiltCon. I mean, I've done YouTube videos of instruction and all of that, but this will be my first in person. So talk about getting thrown in the deep end. But since then, I've been getting invitations to teach foundation paper piecing. I've gotten a lot of questions about how to design, and that's something I'd like to develop in the future. It's just a matter of time for me, because that will be quite detailed. But for now, I do have some instructional videos, but I'm hoping in this next year, as I take Pride and Joy Quilting to the next level, to be able to do things that people can sign up for and participate in. So that's definitely something I'm looking forward to in 2020.
So if people want to get a hold of you, how do they get a hold of you?
prideandjoyquilting.com is my website. I would say my primary social media platform is Instagram.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today and sharing all your knowledge. I'm sure everyone who watches will appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for the honor of your time.
I hope you've enjoyed my interview with Veruschka Zarate. I had not realized all the challenges in designing these patterns. I'm just starting my Heart of a Lion quilt, and I'm going to appreciate it all the more. I'll have Veruschka's contact information below to her website, her social media, and her shop. Next up on Karen's Quilt Circle is Ruth DeVos, a fiber artist from Perth, Australia. She has a very distinctive style, and we will be talking about her journey to becoming a commercial artist. You don't want to miss it, so be sure to subscribe. Next time you're in your sewing room, make sure you have Karen's Quilt Circle playing in the background. I have interviewed so many amazing people. Let one inspire you. And while you're decluttering your sewing space is the perfect time to listen. I'll leave a link to my sewing room declutter playlist as well. Take care, and I'll see you next time.